Welcome to the channel, folks. My name's Shane. In today's video, I'm going to give you a video shooter's review of the Viltrox AF35mm F1.8 prime lens. Just to let you know, I've been shooting with this lens now for the last few weeks. I've shot with it in every lighting condition, and I'll show you samples in different situations. I've also used this both handheld and with a gimbal, and I've got some really great results. The Viltrox 35mm is far more affordable than the Sony 35mm F1.8 prime that I use for just about every video in this room. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how this compares up against the Sony at the end of the video. A massive thank you to Viltrox for sending this out for the review. I really appreciate it. This video won't be too spec heavy. I'm going to talk more about the functionality and usability of this lens, who it's for, whom I want to give it a miss, and where I think it shines the best. To kick things off, let's take a look at some footage I shot using a gimbal on a bright sunny day. I'm using the no picture profile on the Sony A7S III paired with this lens. Let's take a look. All the sample footage you just saw was shot using f1.8, and the autofocus did an extremely good job. It had no problems tracking around its eye every time she faced the camera, and anytime she turned around, it also stayed locked on. There wasn't any pulsing or hunting or anything weird going on, so this really delivers when it comes to AF performance. If you plan on shooting in low light, the Viltrox 35mm f1.8 absolutely delivers, while also delivering some character, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. But I was really impressed with the footage I was able to shoot with this paired with the Sony FX3. In low light, the autofocus still performed really solid. I was surprised just how well it worked. Third-party lens on a Sony camera body still gave me excellent eye autofocus, so that's always a good thing. Anytime around and turned away from the camera, it still stayed locked on. You might have noticed I chose some synthwave for that particular clip, and the reason why is because I really felt like this lens gave me some retro vibe, especially on the bokeh, the out of focus areas, those big round circles that pop up. It did have some imperfections in the bokeh, but I still think it added character, and the overall image quality was very pleasing, and they're just straight out of camera colors. This, paired with the FX3 or any other Sony full-frame camera for low light, is a really great combination. Let's talk about build quality. In Australia, this is almost half the price of the Sony equivalent, and it's built just as well. It feels great in the hand. It weighs 400 grams or 350 without the lens caps and the lens hood attached. So if you plan on taking those off, you can get a really lightweight lens with this. Now, one of the standout features is the focus ring. It feels really nice and smooth in the hand. It's not scratchy, it's not making any noise, and it just feels really good. And we also get a clickless aperture ring. So out of automatic, which does click into place, you can go from f16 all the way to f1.8 nice and smoothly, which is great for video shooters. So that's why I think this is a really great option for people shooting mostly video. Let's talk about some of the things that I don't love about this lens before we get into who this is for and the overall experience with it. So the minimum focusing distance on the Viltrox comes in at 40 centimeters, which is over 1 foot. So the minimum focusing distance is very long compared with the Sony, which is almost half at 22 centimeters. So if you plan on shooting anything close up, this wouldn't be the lens to use. I'll overlay some photos so you can see the difference between the Viltrox at 40 centimeters minimum focusing up against the Sony with 22 centimeters. It's vastly different, so any close-up photography or video work I would give this one a miss. The next thing that I noticed with the Viltrox is it's not as sharp as the Sony 35mm F1.8. So those are the two things that you need to take into account. But I think the sharpness or lack thereof lends itself to having more character, especially in those low light situations where it gave me a really great retro vibe. The last critique I have of this lens is going between infinity and minimum focusing distance using the focusing ring takes far too long. This will hopefully be adjusted in firmware with an upgrade thanks to that port on the inside of the lens. Focus breathing is really well controlled, and this is how much the edge of the frame moves when you go from infinity to minimum focusing distance. And being that we get a minimum focusing distance of 40 centimeters, the elements don't have to move as far, giving us less focus breathing. I didn't notice any major issues with chromatic aberration or color fringing in comparison to other lenses. The only time I did notice this was when water was hit by direct sunlight in a really particular way, but otherwise it's well controlled. Let's talk about who this lens is for, starting with the autofocus. So the autofocus works extremely well, both in face detection mode or anytime the subject was facing away from the camera, it still maintained focus. I also set up a test in the studio here using touch to focus on the back of the LCD screen on the Sony A7S III, and it worked every single time, albeit slightly slower than the results with the Sony 35mm. 35mm is a really practical focal length. Anytime I'm here in the studio, I'm using a 35mm lens. It's a good compromise between 24 and 50 while still being more flattering to your face than 24mm will be. So overall, this will deliver in the studio. It will work great in this type of situation for face detection or eye detection autofocus, depending on the system that you're using. Or if you plan on using a one area mode on any of your cameras, set up the box accordingly and it will work well. Over to the Viltrox 35mm F1.8 for a seated headshot like this. So we're going to see whether or not there's a massive difference in terms of image quality between the Viltrox and the Sony that you were looking at for the entirety of the video for this studio shot. So let me know in the comments whether or not you can see a difference and what that difference is. Considering the price, I think Viltrox have really nailed it when it comes to their 35mm F1.8. The autofocus works beautifully. I love the character of this lens, albeit while the bokeh balls might not be technically perfect, I think it adds a lot of character. And I love the low light performance. So overall, this is a really solid buy for the money. Again, this comes in at roughly half the price of the Sony 35mm F1.8, at least where I live. I'll leave global links down below so you can check it out in your part of the world. But great lens. Thanks again to Viltrox. Let us know your thoughts. If you have any questions, let us know. If you want to check the specs, again, I'll leave all that stuff down in the description. Thanks again. Catch you soon. See ya.